Okay, so today we are diving into U.S. hegemony.
Okay.
You've sent over some excerpts from a textbook chapter on this,
Yay.
and honestly, it's a lot. It's a meaty one.
Yeah, it's big. It really
Right.
makes you think about
It
how
does.
we understand power,
Yeah.
especially in this context of international relations.
Yeah, and it's something that I think people kind of have a surface level understanding of, but this chapter really digs deep
It
into how the
does.
U.S. exerts its influence globally
Yeah.
in ways that people might not even really think about.
And I think one of the things that we often do is we just focus on military strength
Right.
when we're talking about a country's power.
Well, yeah, because that's the most
It's the most obvious, right?
Yeah, it's the most in your face. I mean, the chapter mentions how the U.S. military can basically reach anywhere in the world, like anytime.
Right. That's what they call hard power.
Hard power.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's like
Look at the
you know,
military.
yeah, the military force.
Yeah, exactly.
But obviously there's more to the story than that.
Yeah, definitely.
So what else is there?
I think the chapter really emphasizes that U.S. power is much more than just that.
Okay.
It's almost like setting the rules of the game.
So less about outright force, more about just like influence.
Exactly.
What does that even look like?
So the chapter breaks it down into three distinct types.
Okay.
You've got your hard power.
Right.
We already talked about that.
Uh-huh.
Then you've got what they call structural power.
Okay.
And this is like shaping the systems that power operates within.
Okay.
And a great example that they give is the MBA degree.
Oh yeah. What's the deal with MBAs?
Right. So, like, did you know that the first business schools were all American?
I did not know that.
And now the MBA is like the business qualification
You have to have one if you're
globally.
if you're going to be in the business world.
Yeah. And that's structural power in action.
Wow.
It's like this subtle thing where they kind of export their ideas and systems until they become the norm.
And you don't even realize that it's happening necessarily.
Exactly.
It's just like, oh, this is how it is.
Right. You just absorb it.
That's fascinating. I never even thought about that.
Yeah.
What are some other examples of structural power?
We can even think about something like the internet.
Oh, interesting.
It started as a U.S. military project.
Oh, right.
And even today, it relies heavily on like U.S.-owned infrastructure. So that gives them a very powerful position to kind of control the flow of information globally.
Yeah. It's like the language of the internet
Right.
is English.
Exactly.
It's all based in.
The architecture of it is
Yeah.
very much influenced by
Yeah.
the U.S.
Wow, I never thought about that. But it's so true.
Yeah.
Okay, so we got hard power, we got structural power.
Yes.
What's that third one?
The third one is soft power.
Okay.
And this is all about attraction
Okay.
and persuasion.
Okay.
So think blue jeans during the Cold War.
Okay.
They were like the symbol of freedom and
Yeah.
like a little piece of the American dream that people craved.
Okay.
So it's kind of like making your culture so appealing that other people want what you have.
So it's not just about forcing your will on others, it's making your ideas and your way of life seem appealing.
Exactly. And it's not just about products either.
Yeah.
You can think about American movies, music, even fast food.
Oh, yeah, it's everywhere.
It's everywhere.
Yeah.
And it shapes our desires and our perceptions of success.
It's like they're in our heads without us even realizing it.
Right. Exactly.
Okay, so we've got these three flavors of U.S. power, hard, structural, and soft.
Right.
But how does the U.S. actually USD these tools on the world stage?
Right.
Because something tells me it's not always a pretty picture.
Yeah, definitely not.
Yeah, it's almost unnerving when you start to think about how these three forms of power have on the world.
Yeah.
So how about some concrete examples? Like, how has the U.S. actually used hard structural and soft power
Right.
to exert its influence?
Well, the chapter goes into some key events that really illustrate how the U.S. has kind of flexed its global muscles since the end of the Cold War.
Okay.
And you're right, it's not always pretty.
Okay. I'm ready. Hit me with it.
Okay, let's start with the first Gulf War in 1991.
Okay.
This was a decisive victory for the U.S.-led coalition.
Right.
And it really showcased their military superiority at the time.
Yeah, all over the news, it was like smart bombs.
Exactly.
It was like the future of warfare.
Right. But even then, the chapter raises some uncomfortable questions about the aftermath.
Oh.
Like the Highway of Death incident,
Right?
where retreating Iraqi soldiers were bombed.
Yeah.
And some argue that that constituted a war crime.
Right. It's easy to forget that there are very real human costs in all of this.
Yeah.
And I think the Highway of Death really underscores that even in what seemed like this clear victory, the lines can get blurry.
Yeah.
What other examples does the chapter give?
Well, next it moves on to the Clinton years in the 90s.
Okay.
And this is interesting because Clinton's approach, I feel like, was much more focused on soft power,
Okay.
promoting things like democracy and global trade.
Right.
But even then, the U.S. wasn't afraid to use force when it felt necessary.
Right. They mentioned the bombing of Sudan and Afghanistan in
Exactly.
retaliation for attacks on U.S. embassies.
Yeah.
So it's like this weird
Right.
dichotomy of like, we want to promote peace and democracy,
Right.
but also don't mess with us.
Exactly. It's a very kind of contradictory
Yeah.
impulse there.
Yeah, and I guess that kind of sets the stage for 9/11 and the global war on terror,
Sure.
which completely reshaped the world.
It did.
It's weird even calling it a war. You know, it was this like amorphous, open-ended conflict.
It's ongoing.
It's defined so much the 21st century.
Right.
And the chapter doesn't hold back on its critique of the Bush administration's response,
No, it doesn't.
especially the invasion of Iraq.
Yeah, and they explicitly question the motives behind it.
Right, because there was no evidence
Exactly.
for weapons of mass destruction.
Right. They're like, was this really about that or was this about something else?
Right, controlling the oil or...
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of speculation about
Yeah.
what the real motives were there.
And it's not just Iraq, right? It's like the U.S. response to 9/11, I feel like, had these ripple effects
Oh, absolutely.
across the entire globe.
Yeah.
You know, they detained suspects all over the world, often without even like the knowledge of their government.
Right.
And then like holding them in places like Guantanamo Bay,
Exactly.
where they're not protected by international law.
Right. And that's a really important point to emphasize here is that the chapter doesn't just present these events as like isolated incidents.
Okay.
It connects them to this larger pattern of the U.S. acting unilaterally,
Okay.
often bypassing international law and institutions to achieve its objectives.
So we've seen how the U.S. has wielded its power
Yeah.
and honestly is a little unsettling.
Yeah.
Are there any limits to this dominance?
That's the big question.
Like if it can happen in Iraq, could it happen anywhere?
Right.
It
Exactly.
kind of like if it can happen there, can it happen anywhere?
Yeah, exactly.
Like even in our own backyards.
Right.
It's a scary thought.
Yeah. So is there any hope? Like, does anything or anyone hold the U.S. in check?
Well, that's a crucial question, and the chapter does offer some reassurance, I think.
Okay.
It identifies 3 major constraints on U.S. hegemony,
Okay.
and the first one might surprise you. It comes from within the U.S. itself.
Really?
Yeah.
Are you saying that they're their own worst enemy?
In a way, yeah. The U.S. political system, with its checks and balances,
Right.
actually creates limitations.
Okay.
We've got different branches of government, the media, public opinion. They can all act as brakes on the use of American power.
So even if a president wants to go all in on something like Congress or the courts or even just like public protests can hold them back.
Exactly. And this isn't just theoretical. The chapter talks about how there's growing skepticism towards U.S. foreign policy.
Especially after the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Yeah.
And that public sentiment is a powerful constraint on what the U.S. government can actually do.
Okay, so the people have a voice.
Exactly.
That's good to know. What about pressure from outside the U.S., though?
Yeah.
Surely other countries kind of push back against U.S. dominance.
They do, and that's the second constraint allies pushing back.
Okay.
And the chapter specifically points to NATO as an example.
Okay.
It is a U.S.-led alliance, but it's also a platform where European countries can voice concerns and potentially moderate U.S. actions.
It's like, hey, America, we're on your team, but maybe don't go rogue on this one.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it,
Fine.
because the U.S. relies on its allies for
Yeah.
legitimacy and support on the world stage.
They don't want to alienate everyone.
Exactly. Alienating them completely is not a winning strategy.
No, it's not. But let's be real for a second. The elephant in the room here is China.
Right.
They're the rising power.
Right.
They're the ones with the economic clout and kind of the ambition to challenge U.S. dominance.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the third and arguably most significant constraint, the rise of other powers.
Okay.
It's not just China either. It's
Yeah.
Russia, it's India,
Mhm.
it's even potentially like a coalition of developing countries
Right.
that could chip away at U.S. influence in the future.
So it's not this like unipolar world anymore.
Exactly. It's becoming increasingly multipolar.
And the future is uncertain. There are many different players influencing how things are going to unfold.
Absolutely.
That's a little scary, but also kind of exciting.
It's both.
Yeah. This whole deep dive has really got me thinking, though. It's easy to feel powerless when you're talking about something as massive as like U.S. hegemony. What can one person even do about it?
Well, that's a question that the chapter grapples with too.
Yeah.
And it actually ends on a hopeful note.
Okay.
It argues that resistance is possible.
Okay.
And it can come from the most unexpected places.
Where?
Think NGOs, social movements, artists, writers.
Oh, wow. Okay.
All these actors can challenge the dominant narrative and offer alternative visions of a more just and equitable world.
So it's about staying informed, being engaged, raising your voice.
Exactly.
Those are all forms of power, too,
Absolutely.
even if they don't involve tanks and missiles.
Right, exactly. Never underestimate the power of simply asking questions,
Yeah.
challenging assumptions, and refusing to accept the status quo. That's where real change begins.
Wow. What a deep dive.
Yeah.
So much to think about.
It really puts things in perspective, doesn't it?
It does. And I think that's the point of all this, right?
Yeah.
This chapter wasn't just about understanding U.S. power. It was about encouraging us to think critically
Exactly.
about our place in the world.
Yeah, like the systems we live in.
Yeah.
And the role that we choose to play.
Because whether we realize it or not, U.S. hegemony impacts all of us.
It
It
does.
shapes the clothes we wear, the technology. We use the very fabric of our, globalized world.
Absolutely.
And I think understanding how it works is the first step towards reclaiming our own agency and shaping a future that works for everyone.
I love that. Couldn't have said it better myself.
So to our listener, we leave you with this. Think about how U.S. hegemony in all its forms is playing out in your life, in your community, in the world around you. What makes you uncomfortable? What inspires you to act? Because in a world grappling with the influence of a superpower, awareness is power, and your choices matter.
So well said.
That's it for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.